Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I am your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield. We're very glad right now to be joined by Jesse Rabinowitz. Jesse is the Campaign and Communications Director at the National Homelessness Law Center. He led the communications and power building work on the historic Johnson versus Grants Pass Supreme Court case. He also leads the Housing, Not Handcuffs campaign, which brings together local, state, and federal partners to fight against laws that make it a crime to live outside and push for housing and other proven solutions to homelessness. Jesse, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to start in the past to bring us up to the present. Back in July, Trump signed an executive order that, as pointed out by NHLC, quote, expands the use of police and institutionalization to respond to homelessness, prioritizes funding for states that treat homelessness as a crime and end housing-based solutions, and cuts off funding for life-saving programs like harm reduction, end quote. And I wanted to check in with you. We're recording this on Thursday, October 16th. I wanted to check in with you about what that situation looks like now that we're several months removed from this order. How is this showing up around the country? And how, in your mind, is this different from previous anti-human legislation that targets the unhoused?
It's a great question. So I want to put it in a bit of context. Trump ran openly stating his desire to round up homeless people and force them into government-run detention camps. And that's consistent with his both rhetorical and stated policy goals rooted in racism, rooted in locking people up he doesn't like or he doesn't want to see. And he is also deeply connected to billionaires, including a guy named Joe Lonsdale, the founder of the Cicero Institute, who have been peddling these anti-homeless laws both at the state level and now at the federal level for the past several years. Those same billionaires were deeply involved in the Grants Pass case, and we are seeing a coalescence of these tech billionaires from the Palantir orbit coalesce around the White House and now target people who are living outside. And we think it's important to root that in an explicit understanding that that is part of Trump's authoritarian takeover of the country. He is purposely targeting people who he believes to have little public sympathy, like homeless folks, like migrants, like trans folks. So his executive order from about 2 months ago was shocking but not surprising. It's just codifying the things that he's said and his billionaire friends have said out loud for a long time. We saw the executive order written and released, and then a few weeks later we saw the Trump takeover of DC, where I'm based, and we see the takeover of DC as the first testing ground of this executive order. It's notable that Trump was explicitly targeting people who live outside and clearly targeting homeless folks who were in his way. So we know they first attacked homeless encampments that were in direct view of the president's motorcade. So when you look at the routes that Trump took to the Kennedy Center, to his golf course, to the airport, those are the encampments that were cleared first. And we were out there, and I was out there to see dozens of federal agents harassing people experiencing homelessness. And then the next day, police throwing away people's entire possessions. We saw that as the first test of Trump's anti-homeless policies in DC. And it's important to remember that DC, unlike many cities across the country, is primarily controlled by the federal government. Most of our parks, even our little neighborhood parks, are controlled by the National Park Service. So Trump has outsized influence here. And he also is very clear in framing his takeover of DC that what starts in DC will not end here. We've seen him come after cities like Chicago, citing homelessness there and threatening to deploy the National Guard and other federal police to cities he doesn't like across the country. And we need people to recognize that it is not a coincidence that he's using homelessness as a wedge issue to get his foot in the door to take over cities that are primarily Democratic and that are largely run by Black mayors.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds a bit like we've had folks on the show to talk about the prison system, and it sounds a bit like, well, you try doing horrible things to people in prison because society has already decided that they don't care that much about them or at all. And then you expand it outside the walls of prisons, and it seems like it's a similar thing here. We're going to do terrible things to the unhoused because people already find them uncomfortable, and then we can expand that, not just geographically, but socially as well. And kind of in that same vein, I want to kind of widen the lens here, because you kind of have to look at the compounding horrors, because you can't separate homelessness, that's epidemic to the US, from for-profit healthcare, the exorbitant cost of housing, the exorbitant cost of food, the dearth of jobs, the terrible education system that leaves essentially most kids behind, the treating of drug addiction as a criminal problem versus a health problem, et cetera, et cetera. And I was wondering, Jesse, if you could talk a little bit about this kind of toxic ecosystem that surrounds homelessness. And while homelessness isn't a uniquely US problem, it seems like these combined factors altogether are.
I think you're absolutely right. And homelessness is the result of many failed systems, and it is the most visible manifestation of our housing crisis. More people are sleeping outside than ever recorded before. And that's not because more people are choosing to be homeless, it's because more people can't afford rent. Half of renters in this country pay more than they can afford each month. 1 in 4 people worry about imminently becoming homeless, and one in 5 people spend 100% of their income on rent. This is not a housing system that works for most people. It's a housing system that sucks profit off of people for trying to get by, trying to live. And what Trump is saying now is that if you can't afford rent, we're not going to not only not help you, we're going to throw you into a detention camp. At the same time, Trump and his Republican cronies are cutting budgets for affordable housing, cutting budgets for healthcare. So they are making more people poor, they're making more people sick, they're forcing more people into homelessness, and their only solution is to force people into a detention camp. It's important to look at both sides of this. The same billionaires that are pushing for these cruel anti-homeless policies stand to make a ton of money off of Trump's tax cuts for the rich. And instead of prioritizing his billionaire friends' needs, we need elected officials in this country to prioritize the needs of people who are doing their best to survive and need some help from the government. The government's role is to help people when they're struggling. Right now, the government is poised not only to make the social issues that people are facing worse, but to throw people in camps when they have nowhere else to live. It should go without saying that no time in recorded history has thrown people into camps ever been an okay solution. But it's something that Trump openly brags about. And when his HUD secretary was asked about forcing homeless people into detention camps during his confirmation hearing, he wasn't able to give an answer. Anyone who is not able to unequivocally say, no, we don't put people in camps in this country is not only not qualified to run a federal agency, they're just not qualified to work for the government. But those are the people in power, and we have to be honest that their goal is to detain people they don't like and people they don't want to see and disappear them.
And I want to ask a little bit about the legalese here, because technically we don't have a debtor's prison in this country, but I mean, there are people literally, behind bars simply because they're poor, because they can't pay to get out of there. So with this, I mean, that's the national homeless, the national homeless. Wow, I just got stuck on that. It's the National Homelessness Law Center. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like the legal aspects when, we have a law that says this, but then we do this other thing over here, even though we're technically not legally supposed to do that.
I think we're in an interesting time in that the Trump administration doesn't seem to care what's legal and what's not. Every day, this administration is doing things that are both unethical, unlawful, illegal. And I don't want us to get caught in the trap of saying, well, they can't do that because that's illegal. They're already doing things that are illegal. And, we as a legal organization believe that we can and should be fighting these things out in court. But we also know that we need to build the power. We need to build the people power to change public opinion so that more and more people recognize that nobody should be thrown in jail for not being able to afford rent. And that's one of the bright spots that we're seeing in polling that we've seen time and time again, most people in this country recognize that throwing people in jail for sleeping outside is cruel and ineffective. We need politicians to stand up and do their jobs and say, we need a housing system that works for the many and not the few. And nobody should be thrown in jail for not being able to afford rent in a country where more and more people struggle to make ends meet.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of get into a little bit of psychology here for a second, because on this show before we've talked about the culture of violence in this country, from the omnipresence of guns to the psychology of using violence to fix everything, even if you just don't like someone. Add to that, you have got like pop culture like American Psycho, where the murder of the unhoused is just like a passing scene in a movie. And back in September, NHLC noted that on national television, a Fox News host called for the mass murder of homeless people. So not just, putting them in camps, but like actually the mass murder of homeless people. And you also point out in that press release that in the days following, at least 13 people were wounded when a person in Minneapolis opened fire at a homeless encampment. The city's response was to bulldoze the encampment, destroying the belongings of the shooting victims, including in one case, the urn that held the ashes of one of the unhoused person's children. On that same day, an unhoused man was found hanging from a tree in Mississippi. Um, I mean, the violent dehumanization of the unhoused is nothing new, but I think kind of what we're talking about here today is that this is escalating to levels that we have not seen. Could you talk a little bit about this culture of violence and how that relates then to the unhoused and this ramping up of violence that just seems to be okay?
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me about the heaviness that we were feeling in September. That feels like a long time ago, but I know it wasn't. And you're right to point out that violence against homeless folks is not new, just like laws that make it a crime to be homeless are not new. And we're seeing an escalation. There is something notable when the president says these words, when he signs an executive order saying people experiencing homelessness should be put in detention camps because we don't want to see them anymore. And I'm remembering the murder of Jordan Neely, a man who was unwell and experiencing homelessness on a New York City subway. The person who killed him was let off, and the White House then invited the murderer to sit in the presidential box at a football game. Republicans in Congress then worked to award this man who murdered a homeless person a medal, right? People in power in our country hate homeless people. But what they don't realize and what they don't want us to realize is that most of us have way more in common with Jordan Neely than we do with people like Donald Trump and Jeff Bezos. And they are actively trying to turn us against each other, right? This is all part of a calculated play on politicians' parts to deflect blame from their failures to do their job. It is Donald Trump's job to make rent cheaper. It is Donald Trump's job to make sure people can afford healthcare. It is Donald Trump's job to make sure nobody in this country is going without their basic needs like housing and support. He's failing at those jobs. And instead of taking accountability for his failures, he is saying it's the homeless people's fault. They're scary. They're dangerous. It's the migrants' fault. Nothing could be further from the truth. The fault and the cause of homelessness lies with our elected officials' inability or abject failure to do their jobs. And more people are recognizing that it's not the homeless person's fault they can't afford rent. It's the billionaire's fault that none of us can afford rent. And we have to keep our eye on the ball and recognize that we are all hurt by a housing system that privileges the wealthy and not people who are just trying to get by. And this is also the use of violence and violent rhetoric is again part of a textbook fascist agenda, right? We can be violent towards people we don't like because they are less than human. That's what happened in Germany. That's what is happening now. And we need to remember that in addition to coming after migrants and trans folks, Donald Trump is coming after homeless folks. I'm saddened, I'm disturbed that Donald Trump's focus on homelessness is not a major part of the national conversation when it comes to Trump's takeover. And I think that's because nobody wants to talk about homelessness, because we have all internalized this idea that homelessness is an intractable social problem. And it's just not true, right? Homelessness is solvable. Homelessness has not always existed. And we're seeing cities across the country make strides towards ending homelessness. But instead of supporting those steps, Donald Trump is proposing to take us backwards to a time where people were forced into hospitals and where there was no help for people who were trying to make ends meet.
Yeah, and I mean, I like to say that we're all only one or two emergencies away from being homeless in this country because there is zero safety net. So unless you have like a rich family or unless you have a trust fund or something like that, like there's nothing to fall back on. You just fall into the abyss of homelessness. And I feel like that's another psychological factor that makes people uncomfortable and they don't want to recognize that. But I mean, the time might come where you recognize it far too late and you are looking for a tent to sleep in. And um, I wanted to ask you about the Housing Not Handcuffs Act, which is something that you personally work on. Could you talk a little bit about this legislative work that you're involved in?
Sure. So, as a reminder, about 15 months ago, the Supreme Court, in a ruling that will go down as one of the most shameful rulings in the courts past, the case of Johnson versus Grants Pass, the court said that cities can arrest or ticket people for sleeping outside even when they have nowhere else to go. And I want to talk about a few instances of how this is played out in different cities. We also have seen, again, an organization called the Cicero Institute pass some anti-homeless laws in states across the country. Their laws are very similar to Trump's anti-homeless executive order because the same people wrote both of them. And they make it a crime to sleep outside, but they also make it easier to force people into detention camps or psych hospitals. They gut funding for housing and support, and they expand the policing of people experiencing homelessness. In Kentucky, the anti-homeless package that was passed there includes another provision that says that if there is a homeless person on your private property, you can invoke a stand your ground law and use force and even deadly force to remove them. So again, we come back to this societally accepted violence. If there is a homeless person on your property, you can kill them. And in Kentucky, we saw a police officer issue a woman who was sleeping outside a citation. But she was in active labor. She was having a baby. And instead of offering her help, the police gave her a ticket. The police officer said he didn't really believe that she was in labor. She gave birth to a healthy kid later that day. Giving someone a citation for being in labor doesn't help anybody. It doesn't make anybody safer. It just further terrorizes people who have no choice but to sleep outside. In Atlanta, Georgia, a man named Cornelius Taylor was killed while the city was throwing away his tent. He was living a block away from Martin Luther King's Ebenezer Baptist Church, and he was killed over MLK weekend. That doesn't make anybody safer. That isn't anyone's vision of justice. And a man in Florida was found frozen to death after the city threw away his tent to comply with one of these anti-homeless laws. These laws and these policies are harming and killing people already. So the Supreme Court's Grants Pass ruling made it even easier for cities to make it a crime to be homeless. And since that decision about 15 months ago, over 350 cities have introduced laws that make it a crime to be homeless, over 260 of which have passed. Many of these laws have things like $1,000 in fines or 6 months in jail. It should go without saying, but if someone had $1,000, they wouldn't be sleeping outside. And throwing someone in jail for 6 months actually makes it harder for them to find a job and harder for them to find housing. But we know that these lawmakers are not actually interested in solutions. They are interested in demonizing people experiencing homelessness. At the year anniversary of the Grants Pass decision, Congress members Jai, Paul, and Frost introduced the Housing Not Handcuffs Act, which prohibits the federal government from enforcing laws that make it a crime to be homeless. And that would have been incredibly helpful during the Trump takeover in DC, had this law been on the books, because it would have prevented the federal government from harassing people for sleeping outside, even when they have nowhere else to go. And we know that as Trump looks at cities across the country to send the FBI, to send other policing agencies, to possibly send the National Guard, this law would go a long way in mitigating harm caused by these federal agencies. So we are still urging members of Congress to support and eventually pass the Housing Not Handcuffs Act to say that the federal government can't punish people for sleeping outside even when they have nowhere else to go. We've also seen about a dozen similar bills introduced in states across the country, and as state legislative seasons begin in the next few months, we are hoping to pass laws across the country that prevent cities and states from arresting people for sleeping outside when they have nowhere else to go. Because making it a crime to be homeless doesn't only make homelessness worse, it makes us all worse. It misdirects resources, it makes it harder to solve homelessness, and it makes us sicker as a society. If we want to solve homelessness, we need to focus on the real solutions, like getting folks housing they can afford with supports that they need. But again, the Trump administration has already cut funding for healthcare and proposed a budget that would make housing harder to get. We need our elected officials at the city and state level to step up and do their jobs to protect their residents from a federal administration that wants to round up folks and force them into camps.
Yeah, and I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the distinction, because there's a lot of like local and state and federal, and before the Grants Pass thing way back in 2005, 2006, I was unhoused in LA. So that didn't affect me, but there were anti-homelessness laws in LA. So how does this work? Like if LA were to suddenly pass like housing is a human right, and we're not going to criminalize homelessness, how would that then relate to something like Grants Pass or a federal law that says that you got to put them in detention camps? Like, what is the relationship there?
It's really complicated. And I wish I had like a better answer than like it's complicated, and it depends on how all of these things are implemented. So we know that the Trump administration has issued some funding guidelines that are contingent upon cities making it a crime to be homeless, but we don't exactly know how that's going to be implemented. So it's hard to like get in the weeds and figure out how things will impact each other. What I will say is governors and mayors always have incredibly important jobs, and that is true now more than ever. When we look at what happened in Chicago, Trump was threatening to take over the city, and the mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois robustly said, "We don't want you here." And there has been tragic, terrifying, awful ICE activity in Chicago, but it's nothing like the takeover we've seen in DC, where there are literally roaming bands of FBI agents and National Guard all day, every day, all across the city. And what we need elected officials to do right now is to find their backbone and say, don't come to our city. We don't want you here. We don't need you. And your plan is nothing more than political theater. If you actually wanted to focus on things like safety, the Trump administration would do things that we know keep people safe, like funding healthcare and funding housing and funding food and funding education. But again, they're not interested in actually helping people. They're interested in feeding red meat to their base, stoking political fear, and consolidating power. And I think the point you make is, I think it's also important to be named that, like, before Grants Pass and for a long time, cities have been really good at finding ways to make it a crime to be homeless, just like cities are really good at making it a crime to be poor or black or disabled. The Supreme Court rulings certainly made their lives easier and gave them license to do more bad things, But again, this is not new. The new pieces are the Supreme Court said arresting folks is fair game, and the Trump administration saying we think homeless people should be forced into detention camps.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a toxic ecosystem again. So Jesse, kind of wrapping up here, I know that you mentioned building power as a tactic that y'all are working on. What does that look like? And then also, what are some other tactics that NHLC is involved in, both legal and otherwise?
Yeah, I can't comment on like ongoing legal strategy, but it's something that is in our toolbox. And we are so grateful for all of the amazing attorneys that like support us, like pro bono attorneys and attorneys from across the country. We are doing a lot of narrative change and communications work across the country because people get that throwing someone in jail for being homeless is messed up. People understand that. But we need to provide people with the context on how we got here and what the actual solutions are. Most people don't connect homelessness with the rents being too high because people have really internalized this idea that homelessness is not a housing problem. So we have a lot of work that we're doing and a lot of work left to do to remind people that when rent goes up by $100, homelessness goes up by 9%. The housing system and the homelessness crisis are deeply related. They're the same thing, but we have some more public education to do. We're working to build power to pass legislation, to pass budgets, to actually fund the solutions we need. Look, we're honest in the fact that passing a bill that makes it harder to throw someone in jail for being homeless is not justice. That is like an incredibly low floor. It's an embarrassingly low floor, and it's shameful that we even have to fight for that. But our world, the world that we vision, is one where everyone has a safe place to live and everyone is able to thrive. And doing that is going to take building coalitions, building power, talking to people who don't think about homelessness, but maybe think about how the rents are too high, talking to people who think about racial justice or immigration justice, and connecting all of these dots so we can build a country where no one is thrown in jail for not being able to make ends meet and where people have a safe place to live. So a lot of time speaking with amazing community organizers and organizations across the country, and a lot of time trying to shape how the media talks about these things, and a lot of time really empowering folks on the ground to lead. Our service providers, our advocates, our mutual aid organizations, organizers across the country who have been doing this work for a long time are exhausted. And we really need to continue to be cheerleaders for them and to support them in leading in the way that they see fit.
Yeah, and I think that that's so crucial. I lived in DC for like 6 years, and right in Adams Morgan, this gentrifying project was trying to build like luxury condos there in this square that had been used for decades for community organizing, for farmers markets, for little nice concerts and things. And it was also where people who were unhoused slept. And there was this beautiful coalition building of bringing in people who had grown up there and had seen it gentrify, including the unhoused people in the conversation. So just this idea, like, as an organizer, of including unhoused folks in the conversation when we're talking about community organizing, I think is key, and it's often something that gets overlooked. But that was a really crucial piece of that coalition building, and it ultimately saved the little square. So, I mean,
And now they're building affordable housing.
so, I mean, and it feels crazy. You're like, it's just this little square, but it's like that made so much difference to dozens, hundreds of people's lives. And it's also like, that's what we can do. We can work in the spaces that we're in. And so
Yeah,
I
all
think,
fights are local. All fights are local. Nothing good is going to happen from the federal administration right now. We are in blocking awful things from happening mode, but so much good is happening on the local and state level that's where the real action is. And we're so grateful to the amazing folks fighting that fight. Last year, 54 bills to make it a crime to be homeless were introduced in state houses across the country, many by billionaire-backed organizations. state and local advocates defeated 80% of those bills on a shoestring budget. When we fight, we can win, and we just have to fight stronger and harder in a more coordinated way. And we're excited to keep doing that with folks across the country.
Amen. Well, folks, check out homelesslaw.org to read more and learn more about NHLC. Jesse, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and talk about this really underreported and important issue.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope you have a good day.
You too.